Anatomy. Nervous system. Cerebellum. The cerebellum is part of the central nervous system and is the second largest portion of the brain after the prosencephalon or forebrain, hence the name cerebellum, Latin for little brain. It performs different functions. Controls muscle tone and consequently posture through connections with the spinal cord and the vestibular system. The latter is found inside the inner ear and is responsible for balance. Plans, executes and coordinates movements together with the cerebral cortex. Plays a role in learning and memorizing movements. Modulates sensory, acoustic and visual inputs. Modulates the autonomic nervous system, which is not part of the ANS. Is involved in language comprehension and production. The cerebellum is an ovoid structure located within the posterior cranial fossa, in the cerebellar fossae of the occipital bone. The two occipital lobes of the brain lie over it, which are separated from the cerebellum by a fold of dura mater called the tentorium cerebelli. In addition to the anterior margin, which delimits the pacchionian foramen oval, the cerebellum is overlaid by the posterior part of the midbrain called the lamina tecti. The pons and bulb are located anterior to the cerebellum. The only structures separating them from the cerebellum are the fourth ventricle cavity and the anterior medullary velum. Macroscopically, two parts of the cerebellum can be identified, a median portion called the vermis and two lateral regions called the cerebellar hemispheres. In each hemisphere, the cerebellar peduncles are found, which are white matter tracts connecting it to the brainstem. The superior peduncle connects it to the midbrain. The middle peduncle connects it to the pons. The inferior peduncle connects it to the bulb. The three peduncles converge in a cerebellar hilum, a fissure in the rostral part of the fourth ventricle. The superior peduncles are connected by a lamina of white matter called the anterior medullary velum. Together with the posterior medullary velum, connecting the inferior cerebellar peduncles to the vermis, it makes up the roof of the fourth ventricle. The internal surface is covered in ependymal cells. The vela converge in the hilum as well. By converging the two vela and the three peduncles from an acute angle called the fastigium. Sounds like a name of a spell in a Harry Potter universe. Similarly to the cerebral cortex, several curvilinear transverse grooves are found along the surface of the cerebellum. They delimit specific cerebellar areas organized into laminae and lobules, which will be described in a subsequent section. Let us start by describing the external structure. Without considering the cerebellar peduncles, a superior and inferior surface, as well as the circumference, can be identified. The superior surface is actually covered by the occipital lobes of the brain, which separate it from the tentorium cerebelli, located on the squamous part of the occipital bone. The superior surface has a convex shape and features a raised midline area, namely the upper surface of the vermis. The inferior surface has a convex shape as well and includes the cranial fossae and the cisterna magna, also known as the cerebellomedullary cistern. The latter is a space between the arachnoid and the pia mater, which contains liquor. When looking at the central area, a hollow can be observed, called the vallecula. It corresponds to the inferior surface of the vermis. In this hollow, the falx cerebri is located. The falx cerebri is a rather interesting structure, as it is a fold of dura mater in the occipital bone, separating the two cerebellar hemispheres. It stretches sagittally along the cerebellum to the inferior surface of the tentorium cerebelli. Finally, the circumference features a hollow on the front, namely the hilum, delimited by the two medullary velar and 3 pairs of peduncles. Let us now analyze the medullary velar. There are 2 of them. The anterior medullary velum, a superficial layer of white matter connecting the 2 superior peduncles. Together with a deeper layer of grey matter, being continuous with the grey matter of the vermis, it forms the valve of Vucins. The valve stretches from the centre of the cerebellum to the mesencephalic lamina tecti. The inner surface of the anterior velum, lined by the ependyma, forms the upper portion of the roof of the 4th ventricle. The posterior medullary velum, also known as valve of Taran, is a sheet of white matter medially connecting the 2 inferior peduncles. Together with the tectorial membrane, which prolongs it, the velum makes up a double layer. The tectorial membrane is a layer of pia mater enclosing the tela choroidea of the 4th ventricle, responsible for producing liquor. The 2 medullary velar, together with the tectorial membrane, make up the roof of the 4th ventricle. 3 openings can be observed on this level. The median aperture, also known as foramen of Magendie, and 2 lateral foramina of Luschka. These openings connect the 4th ventricle of the cisterna magna. As for the cerebellar peduncles, they are composed of nervous fibre tracts, white matter, that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. We can observe inferior peduncles composed of afferent fibres from the bulb and the spinal cord. Middle peduncles composed of afferent fibres from the basilar pontine nuclei and fibres from the nuclei of the tegmentum of the pons. They are the largest type of cerebellar peduncles. Superior peduncles composed of afferent fibres from the nuclei of the cerebellum en route to the midbrain, specifically to the red nucleus and the thalamus. The vermis, median portion, and the 2 hemispheres are separated by paramedian grooves. The cerebellar hemispheres are in their turn subdivided into lobes and lobules by 5 grooves. The 2 most important are the primary fissure and the posterolateral fissure, which delimit the cerebellar lobes. Following the craniocaudal axis, we can identify the anterior lobe at the front of the primary fissure, the posterior lobe between the primary fissure and the posterolateral fissure, the flocculonodular lobe behind the posterolateral fissure. The lobes, and consequently the vermis, and the related cerebellar hemispheres are in their turn subdivided into lobules by 3 fissures: horizontal, pre-pyramidal, and posterolateral. Within each lobule, secondary fissures are found as well. They subdivide the lobule into laminae and lamellae, according to their depth. The laminae have deeper fissures, whereas the lamellae have more superficial ones. To better understand the different territories of the cerebellum, it is helpful to classify them into archicerebellum, paleocerebellum, and neocerebellum, according to its evolutionary process. The archicerebellum is the oldest territory and corresponds to the flocculonodular lobe. The paleocerebellum developed with the Homo erectus, the first species to be able to stand, and corresponds to the anterior lobe. The neocerebellum developed together with the telencephalon and corresponds to the posterior lobe. Another subdivision, which is more functional, is based on nervous inputs and outputs. It identifies the vestibular cerebellum, the spinocerebellum, and the pontocerebellum. The vestibulocerebellum overlies the archicerebellum and consequently corresponds to the flocculonodular lobe. It receives inputs from the reticular formation and the labyrinth, both directly from the labyrinth fibers passing through the vestibular nuclei of the pons. It sends outputs to the vestibular nuclei of the bulb. Through these connections, the cerebellum is able to control movement and restore balance and ambulation. Therefore, it coordinates both movements of the axial muscles and movements of the head and eyes. The spinocerebellum corresponds to the vermis and the central part of the cerebellar hemispheres. It receives fibers from the spinal cord and the brainstem. Through these connections, it controls both balance and posture, as well as the movement of the limbs. The pontocerebellum includes the lateral areas of the cerebellar hemispheres. It receives fibers from the sensory and motor cortex, sending in its turn tracts to the red nucleus of the midbrain and tracts that return to the motor cortex. Basically, it receives information on details of the movements the body is executing from the periphery to subsequently adjust and refine them. It is interesting to note that the repetition of complex movement modifies these neutral circuits. This is known as plastic effect on the cerebellar circuits. The cerebellum corrects the efferent responses each time, thus increasing the coordination and precision of the motor patterns. We are talking about movements that require a high degree of coordination in such short times to leave no room for awareness. Take, for instance, the movements executed while playing an instrument, which gets smoother and smoother through practice. It is the plastic effect on the cerebellar circuits to make it possible. To better understand the importance of the cerebellar circuits in relation to movement, you simply need to know that a patient with severe brain injuries experiences an oscillatory tremor whenever executing voluntary movements. It is the so-called intention tremor, which intensifies as the body or the affected limb approaches a target. The tremor is the result of the inability of the cerebellar system to plan and refine movements.
Thank you for watching. This video was created by School of Biomedical Sciences, Agora. We hope you enjoyed it. If you're curious or have any doubt or question, please feel free to leave a comment below. If you want to find out more about us or want to support our project, click on the following link to visit our website.